Good evening, everybody. Nice to meet you all. As Michelle said, my name's Paul Wood, aptly named. I'm going to talk to you about trees, and I'm going to start off with a presentation. As Michelle was also saying, questions at the end, please. I won't really be able to keep an eye on the chat while I'm presenting as well. It's a bit difficult for me, but I really look forward to hearing your questions and answering as many of them as I can. So I'm just going to start sharing my screen with you. Just bear with me. And so here we go. I know that sometimes there's a bit of a lag between the screen changing, the image changing, and what you're seeing. So I'll try and allow for that. But here we are in Tower Hamlets Cemetery Park. Now, looking at the chat just as everyone was joining, I saw a lot of people were fairly local. So I suspect many of you have been to Tower Hamlets Cemetery Park. I had never until last week, and Ken gave me a tour around, and I quickly got up to speed with the history of Tower Hamlets Cemetery Park, which was fascinating. I have been to some of the other magnificent 7, including Abney Park, which is not far from where I live, and Nunhead I've been to quite a lot as well, and Highgate. Kensal Green I've been to as well. So I think I've been to many of them, but never Tower Hamlets. So it was fascinating to add that one, tick that one off the list. And it was great to have a look around and see the trees there. So what I discovered was, which many of you will know already, is of course that Tower Hamlets Cemetery Park has been pretty much left for nature to take its course. And now it's very overgrown and wonderful because of it, and is, of course, something of a nature reserve. And it's a woodland. And the trees in there are very interesting. There's lots of trees you would expect to see, like this one, which is a sycamore. The tree, which, of course, grows all over London, given half a chance, is a maple. It has the winged seed, or samara, which helicopter to the ground and will seed themselves wherever they can gain a foothold in anybody's garden, as gardeners get a bit annoyed by them. But I rather like them because they're really good trees for lots of reasons, even though some people might tell you they're not native. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but maybe that's a question which will come up at the end. I look forward to that. This is one of the fantastic old trees in the park, and this is one of the London planes. And I was really struck by this one because it had these very arched branches, and it was clearly there before a lot of the other trees were. It looks like it's been a canopy tree that was over the otherwise open ground. You can tell that by the way the branches all spread out as they do. And there's a lot of, well, there's a few other large old plane trees in the park which are similar sort of age, and I was very interested in those particularly because these look like the first trees there. There are some other old trees and a few other curiosities as well. I came across this tree which I thought was very interesting, and it's a tree which you do see around occasionally. It's an ash tree. Many people will be familiar with an ash tree, and it's pinnate or compound leaves, which means it has small leaflets on a single stem, which makes up one single leaf. But this tree has just long single leaves. And many of you might have noticed this tree and wondered what it is. And Ken and I were looking at it, and Ken knew what it was. And I've seen a few of these, and I realized that it is a one-leaved ash, which is very unusual. And particularly so in the cemetery, because often when you find a one-leaved ash, they've been planted as a sort of something, an ornamental, I suppose. But of course, these types of trees, these cultivars, these sort of different trees, a bit like a copper beech, will spring up of their own accord. And I wondered whether the one-leaved ash was perhaps a tree which was self-sown. it's a really good example of a one-leaved ash, because sometimes you see them reverting to having the multiple leaflets. So that was a highlight, I thought. As you can tell, it was a bit of a rainy day when we were there. Another bunch of trees which I thought were very interesting were the lime trees along where the old lane used to be, near the railway track in the southern part of the cemetery, across the track from the chalk grass area. There's lots of lime trees there that have been potentially coppiced at some time in their life, and they're multi-trunked. And I really couldn't tell whether these were particularly old or whether they were planted as multiple trunk trees, but they were very interesting. And there's a whole, and they clearly mark the boundary of the park as well. I wish there were more records to tell us a bit more about them. So those are some of the highlights of Tower Hamlets Cemetery Park for those who've never been. Certainly my highlights anyway. Lots of other things to see there as well. But as well as that, I was going to tell you about other things in London. So first of all, I was going to tell you about it being a forest. So this is a view from North London and looking over the city, and it shows the very green nature of London and how it's actually covered in trees. Most of them are in the parks, gardens, and a lot are on the streets. And London has something like 23% canopy cover. So if you look down at London from space, you see 20% of it with trees. In fact, I think it's something like 47% of it is green and blue, which means water as well. So it's a remarkably green city. And indeed, you could call it a forest, because a UN definition describes a forest as having 20% tree cover. So London gets above that, although I think, strictly speaking, urban areas are not included. So another thing about London, of course, is that it's grown up fairly rapidly. Even though we think of it as a very old city, the size of London, the contemporary size of London is essentially a Victorian thing, and Tower Hamlets Cemetery Park, being a Victorian cemetery, is part of that development as London expanded and grew very rapidly in maybe less than 100 years. And this is Muswell Hill in North London, which was constructed from about 1900, at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, end of the Victorians, and mostly a Edwardian part of London. And what this shows is tree-lined streets, which became de rigueur in London at that time. So from about 1870, streets lined with trees became a very popular thing in London. And aspirational new parts of London were planting trees wherever they could. Muswell Hill is a really great example of a new development where street trees were integral to it. And now those trees, which are all London planes, a lot of trees of that period are London planes, are well pollarded, like the trees in the picture behind me. They're kept on a very tight leash, so they don't grow too big and don't extract too much water and cause subsidence, which is a little bit of a myth as well. And maybe that's a question which some of you might want to ask me about at the end. So this is Muswell Hill, the urban nature of the Green City of London. This is South London, and I'm hoping these are coming up for you fairly rapidly. If anybody's having problems seeing these, let me know, and I will. Oops, I'm just going to go back and get the chat up so I can just make see. So, oops, I'm going a bit too fast there. So, South London. This is looking out from One Tree Hill, which is on a oak, and it gives a sense of just how green the city is again. And there you can glimpse the city of London through the trees of that very great, it's a great viewpoint. The tree on the right as well, that's covering a lot of the right-hand side of the image is, of course, the London plane. You can tell by the leaves on it and the mottled bark. Of course, London planes aren't from London. Maybe I'll talk about that in a minute as well. So I thought I'd look at some of the landscapes that you find in London. So here they are. First of all, the Thames Estuary. And this is right down, right at the very edge of London. This is Erith. And looking across the estuary to Raynham. And that hump in the middle of the image is the Raynham landfill site, which has been with us for over 150 years. And it's now a physical feature of the landscape, a man-made hill where once there was not one. It's still working. It contains it's over 100 hectares of landfill where Londoners have been disposing of their trash for the last 150 years. And it's quite remarkable. But what is even more remarkable is that just downstream from here, in the mud, at very low tides, you can find fossilized tree stumps. And these are several thousand years old, which are preserved in the mud. And archaeologists have been digging at them, looking up at working out what they all are. And what they've discovered is that a lot of them are yew trees. So at one time, London's river was lined with yew trees, a tree now which we associate very much with great churchyards and churches and so on. Of course, yew trees are poisonous to livestock, and maybe Neolithic men and women removed yew trees. An interesting thought. Maybe they were much more common than they are now. Certainly the archaeological record appears to show that on the further reaches of the Thames. In fact, fossils have been found as far as Blackwall as well. The next one is Epping Forest. So Epping Forest shows a very ancient way of managing woodland. Again, the influence of the Victorians is here again. So I think that might be a common thread, which is I've just realised subconsciously is running through this, and I'm associating it with Tower Hamlets. So Epping Forest is an ancient forest, meaning its origins go back for a very, very long time. It appears in records past the Domesday Book. It's many centuries, if not millennia old, has always been a woodland of some description. And since the Victorian period, it's entered a new phase. So these trees, which are beech trees, have been pollarded. And you can see what that means in this case is that they get cut off at this height, above head height, where the branches are harvested in this case to provide wood, and that would have been used to produce charcoal, potentially, probably for firewood in London and for other uses as well. So the reason that they were pollarded is that Epping Forest is a royal forest. It's a royal hunting forest. And the point of that is that the most important resource that this forest provided was game. And that means deer, and many centuries ago, wild boar, when we hadn't killed them all. But the deer still roam Epping Forest. And to stop them nibbling the shoots, trees were cut at this height that was above the height of the deer browse line. So the deer had free rein, the trees were secondary, and the people that harvested them, the local commoners, had to do this at a very difficult process to do it like this. But these were pollarded for centuries, but they were last pollarded in the 1870s when the City of London Corporation bought Epping Forest, took it over, and essentially preserved it in aspic. So what was a woodland, a working woodland, became a sort of memorial to a working woodland. And now it's this fantastic place, which is still very much an ancient woodland, but not managed in a way that it would have been 150 years ago. So what we see is 150 years of growth on top of what it would have looked like in the 1870s. Fascinating place. This is South London again. This is on the edge of London. This is down in Croydon. And this is Hutchinson's Bank, which is a nature reserve. And it's chalk downland. And it's another ancient landscape like woodland. has been here since Neolithic times, when early humans removed the tree cover to graze their animals, and then consistently did that for thousands of years. And chalk downland has grown up as a really important habitat for wildflowers and insects, and especially butterflies, as the little area of chalk grassland at Tower Hamlets Cemetery Park shows. But what happened at Hutchinson's Bank in Croydon is that it was left to its own devices, and the trees came back, because they always will. And of course, now this is managed by the London Wildlife Trust, and they're removing the trees to take it back to chalk grassland. So this is a sort of slight conundrum, really, in London's forest cover, in that it's being reduced here. But I think for a really good reason, to get back to the chalk grassland and all the amazing habitats that exist there. My next slide is another form of ancient tree management, and this is another woodland in London, another ancient woodland. This is Coldfall Wood in Finchley, East Finchley. Coldfall Wood is very like Epping Forest in many ways, although it's pretty tiny. But unlike Epping Forest, this was coppiced. So the trees were coppiced at their base rather than head height, because any foraging animals would have been blocked out of this woodland. Much easier way to manage the trees. But of course, like pollarding, it's a very sustainable way of managing the trees, because the trees are cut down and then they regrow from these coppice stools. And the trees that you find in Coldfall Wood are mostly hornbeam, which is the tree which is possibly most associated with London. All the ancient woodlands in London are full of hornbeams, and in fact, London is slap bang in the middle of the hornbeam belt, as I like to call it, which goes from North Kent through Essex and Hertfordshire and through what was Middlesex. And it's the dominant tree in many places, and a tree that was much liked by Londoners because it has very hard timber. That's where the name hornbeam comes from. And it was very useful for firewood because it makes really, really good charcoal. So that's Coldfall Wood, a very wonderful little woodland worth visiting. And I thought I'd talk about some of the trees in London as well, some individual trees. So these are some trees which I picked out kind of at random, but they're trees that I've know and love, and I thought I'd share their stories with you. So first of all, this is in Tottenham. This is the Bruce Castle Oak, and it's a 500-year-old oak tree, which is in Bruce Castle Park. It's a sessile oak, which is unusual for London. There are two native oak trees, as some people may know, the English or pedunculate oak and the sessile oak, of which this is one. Sessile oaks tend to be associated with wetter, more western and more northerly parts of Britain, so they're rather unusual in London. But of course, sessile and English or pedunculate oaks will interbreed, and there are many, many hybrid oaks around. But this tree, been there for 500 years, hopefully it could be here for hundreds more years. It's propped up now, and it's a real local landmark, one that I feel needs to be deserves to be known about more widely. So that's why I included that one. It's worth a visit to Tottenham to go and see. The next tree is a yew tree. Now, I was talking about how they were very ancient trees that were found along the river there at Erith. And this is actually London's oldest tree, which is a yew tree. Yew trees can live for centuries and millennia. This is in Totteridge in North London. It's in the graveyard there. And this tree is very wizened and in decline, but it's probably been in decline for hundreds of years and will be in decline for hundreds more years. And it's thought that it's anything between 1,000 and 2,000 years old. It's very difficult to tell with very old trees because they tend to be hollow. So you can't really count their rings, but then you wouldn't really want to do that anyway because you need to cut it down. So that's why that estimate is so wide, from 1,000 to 2,000 years. But just thinking about that, if it's 2,000 years old, it means it was here when the Romans arrived in London. And if it's a mere 1,000 years old, it was here when the Normans arrived. So it's seen a lot. It's very, very ancient, and is a very important tree. I wish there were more very, very ancient yews in London. This is another old tree. It's not that ancient. This is in South London. This is Lesnies Abbey, which is Abbey Wood. It's a mulberry tree. Now, there's a lot of mulberry trees in London, a surprising amount. Many of them are quite old. And this is a tree next to the ruins of an abbey that was destroyed during the Reformation. The abbey was founded about 1,000 years ago. It's just a ruin now, but this tree is next to the ruins. And you could be forgiven for thinking it was as old as the ruins. But mulberry trees have this habit of looking much, much older than they actually are. And I was talking to Peter Coles, who some of you may know as the mulberry tree expert in London. And he was telling me he thought it was about 200 to 250 years old. So not that old, but nevertheless, very attractive, photogenic tree, worth going to Abbey Wood to have a look at. Wait till the Thames Link is open. Not the Thames Link, the Crossrail. So my next one is another very old tree. This one's not as old as the yew tree, but this is an oak tree that's thought to be anything up to 800 years old. And this is in Richmond Park. And Richmond Park is full of very, very old trees. Like Epping Forest, Richmond Park was a royal hunting forest and still pretty much is, although they don't do much hunting there. Well, they do, but they don't do it for food. They sort of do it quietly when nobody's there. And it's really to cull the deer. So like Epping Forest, this tree was pollarded in its past, and you can see that by its very squat appearance and the branches that are coming out of that of the short trunk. And again, that was to stop the deer browsing it. This one's known as the Royal Oak. It's hollow. You can't find it on any of the maps of Richmond Park, but it is fenced off now, so it's obviously regarded as very important. And it's possibly the oldest tree in Richmond Park. And there are, as I say, many, many ancient trees there. And indeed, Richmond Park has more ancient trees than some whole countries do. So, for instance, Belgium has less ancient trees than you can find in Richmond, which is quite an interesting fact, I think. So they're very important ancient trees because they support all sorts of rare and unusual wildlife, including all sorts of insects and fungi that will only live on decaying wood and sometimes of very old trees. So you'll find these in places like many ancient woodlands and so on. So it's very important to leave old trees so that the insects can feed off them. So when a tree falls, to leave it on the ground and to let them to let them die gracefully, I suppose, age gracefully. And it's a very important habitat. So at one time, trees would tend to be cleared before they got to this sort of ripe old age, which seems a pity. Now I think we regard them as picturesque and are beginning to realise just the value to other forms of wildlife they offer as well. These are a couple of remarkable trees, urban trees. The one on the left is a plane tree. This one is in the City of London. It's on Cheapside. It's called the Cheapside Plane, in fact, and it's thought to be anything up to 300 years old. And it's remarkable, I think, because it's survived on this little corner, which is a former graveyard in the city, of a church which was never rebuilt after the Great Fire. And the little low-rise building in front of it has never been redeveloped. And it's very early Victorian. And unlike most other buildings in the city, it's only got one story above the ground floor. And that's because that tree has kind of protected it. So the tree is remarkable and worthy of saving the buildings in the City of London. Not many that can claim that distinction. And the one on the right is another local landmark, a bit like the Bruce Castle Oak. It's not a particularly old tree, although it's quite a distinctive tree, and it's a giant redwood, which is next to platform 1 at New Cross Gate Station. It's in a very precarious position, I think, on this little bit of edgeland, perhaps, next to the railway. Many people that live in that part of the world know this tree and recognise it. And it's a tree which, another tree which I would like to champion. So I always like to tell people about it, so you can know about the New Cross Gate giant redwood. So wherever you get the overground down there, look out for it. And the next one is London's oldest plane tree. So plane trees, as I mentioned, aren't from London. They've got this name, the London plane tree, which is a Victorian device. They probably would have been known as something like the hybrid plane before that. And actually they come from, or they arose, shall we say, in Spain or France, because they're a hybrid between two species of plane, the Oriental plane, which you can see in London. There are quite a few around, not very common, and a North American species called the American sycamore, which you'll never find in London. And these two trees hybridized and produced a vigorous hybrid offspring, the hybrid plane, which happened in the 17th century after the discovery of North America by Europeans and plants being brought back to Europe. And that hybridization occurred in, as I say, Spain or France. And when this new tree appeared, it was then realized that this had a lot of potential, and it was quickly shipped around Europe, and a couple appeared in the UK. This one's in Barnes, and it's thought to be taken from 1880. And there's another one that's similarly of a similar age at Ely Cathedral in Cambridgeshire. And these two trees are the oldest plane trees in the UK. And this one's so enormous, I couldn't actually get a photograph of it. So I just thought I'd take a picture of its trunk, but it's elephantine. And it just shows how big and old these trees are likely to become. We don't know how old they're going to become, because they've only been with us since the 17th century. But they could well live as old as oak trees. The one in Barnes has still got many, many centuries left in it. It's not hollow or anything like that. It really is in the prime of its life. So the old plane trees in Tower Hamlets, elderly as they are not a patch on Barney down at Barnes. This is another local landmark, and this is in Finsbury Park, which is near where I live. And it's an almond tree, which comes into flower in January or February in most years. It's really remarkable because it's a harbinger of spring. And the other thing which is great about it is it's got this really bizarre corkscrew trunk, which I have no idea how it developed that. But again, it's a tree which lots of people I know that live around here know it and recognize its amazing pink blossom, which occurs in, as I say, late winter in most years. And it really is a tree that's worth having a look out for. There's the close-up of the blossom, which is really quite stunning. And this is another great old plane tree. This one is down in Brixton, and for many years this was called the Tate Plane because it sits outside the Tate Library, which is Brixton Library and the Ritzy Cinema. Subsequently, this whole piazza has been developed, and now it's called the Windrush Square. And I kind of think that it's time to rename this plane, so maybe it should be called the Windrush Plane. And it's a fantastic example of a London plane that was planted in the heyday of London plane tree planting by the Victorians, when they became known as London planes. And the reason they became known as London planes is that London was planting so many of them, but we were in fact late to the party. Paris was planting a lot more of them before they became popular in London. But around about 1870, when the Thames embankment was built, plane trees were chosen to be planted along there. And that caused the Victorians to think or to realise that thoroughfares, streets, and in London should have trees planted along them, and plane trees became the tree of choice. Around about the same time, and maybe a decade or so earlier, lots of squares and parks were planted with plane trees. So plane trees were planted in places like Victoria Park, Highbury Fields, London Fields, Southwark Park, and most likely that was when the Tower Hamlets trees were planted. They could be planted when the cemetery was open, which I think is 1840s or 50s. I can't quite remember. I'm sure someone will correct me on that one. And also I thought it would be interesting to talk about some of the people that have shaped the urban forest over the years. And these come from various different places. And first of all, we're going to go to Bermondsey. So Bermondsey is the bit of London in South London between Tower Bridge and Rotherhithe. And before 1965, it was a borough of its own, and it was swallowed into Southwark. So there were many other different boroughs in London at that time. Stepney, for instance, would have been a borough of its own. Stoke Newington was a borough, and Bermondsey was a borough. Bermondsey was a particularly industrial and poor and squalid area of London. And in the early 1920s, Ada Salter became the mayor of Bermondsey. She was the first female mayor in London. And mayors back in that time had a lot more power than they do now of local boroughs. And she was able to really start to make significant changes in Bermondsey. So she set about knocking down a lot of the slums and redeveloping them, building flats and building model housing, and also set up what was known as the Beautification Committee. And the Beautification Committee's purpose was to green the borough. So she was very influenced by the ideas of people like Octavia Hill, who had started the Garden City movement. And there were already existing garden cities and garden villages like Letchworth and Leighton Buzzard and places like that in Hertfordshire. And her vision was to transform Bermondsey into a garden suburb. But it was very difficult because the land was relatively, there was relatively little of it, and it was very, very densely populated. There were over 100,000 people that lived there. So what she did was build low-rise flats, model housing, and plant trees. And within something like 10 years, they managed to plant 6,000 or 7,000 trees in Bermondsey, which is a really significant amount. And as politicians are wont, they needed a tree that was going to grow very, very rapidly. And the tree which Ada was particularly enamored by is this one, which is a tree of heaven. And tree of heavens are trees of heaven, even are very attractive trees, but they're rather invasive. So they will seed themselves wherever they can, and they push up suckers wherever they can. And no doubt they occasionally appear in Tower Hamlets Cemetery Park, and maybe anyone who volunteers there has pulled them up. But you will see them all over London railway embankments and so on. They're on the march. They grow very, very rapidly. This tree is probably only 20 years old, and they will not live longer than about 70. You do see them planted in parts of East London. In Hackney, I've seen them, and no doubt in Tower Hamlets too. There are some good examples of these trees which would have been planted around town because, apart from anything else, they were known to be very, very resistant to pollution. So when there was a lot more industry in the centre of London, these trees would have been a good choice. This tree, though, is in the Fair Street estate, and it's in the Alfred Salter Playground, and it marks the vault where the ashes of both Ada and her husband Alfred were interred. And when they redeveloped the park in the late 1990s, they decided to plant a tree of heaven to mark the spot, which was otherwise marked with a rather inconspicuous brass plaque. So now this tree of heaven reminds us of the trees of heaven that were planted by Ada Salter to green the city, and that the legacy of Ada Salter is still very much apparent in Bermondsey. You can see trees of heaven planted all over that part of London, on the estates and on the streets, most of them very old now, as they tend not to be replaced by other trees of heaven. But you'll also see lots of young ones that are doing their best to colonise that part of London as well. This is a statue of Ada Salter, which is on Bermondsey Wall East. And you can see there she is with a spade in her hand. And the picture on the left is a street called Wilson Grove, which shows her model housing, what she had a vision of. And this was in the late 1920s, this was built. And the Great Depression of 1929 and the early 30s put paid to her vision of cottage-style housing, and she had to build a lot more flats than she originally wanted to. But nevertheless, she did transform that part of London. And this tree isn't a tree of heaven, although it does look very similar to them. And I've always speculated that maybe this was planted by mistake. It's actually a Caucasian wingnut, which is a very unusual species. And it is planted on the streets here. It's not a great place to have a Caucasian wingnut because they become very, very big and very spreading trees. And I've been speaking to a local historian around here, and he was telling me that these trees were planted after the Great Storm of 1987, and they were planted to replace some tree of heavens which were here, which had got blown over in the storm. And I still wonder whether they were planted by mistake by tree planters thinking they were trees of heaven, because they do have this very similar leaf. So my next story is in Hackney, and Lodgers of Hackney was a nursery. So before Hackney became the densely populated borough that it is now, it was a village in Middlesex, and it was surrounded by fields. And during the 18th century, there were a lot of, it was famed for its nurseries, its plant nurseries and its schools. And in, I think it was the late 18th century, the Lodgers, who were German refugees, set up a plant nursery there. And over a couple of generations, built this into a really magnificent nursery, which supplied trees and other plants to places all over the empire, in fact. And indeed, in Abney Park Cemetery, there are trees which were supplied by Lodgers, which eventually went out of business in 1850, when the land which it occupied, part of which is where Hackney Town Hall is now, was they leased, and it was the lease wasn't renewed because it was required by the landowner to build houses as Hackney was continuing to expand. And one of the last things that happened was that a gigantic palm tree that once resided in the hothouses there, of which they were famed, and visitors came from all over the country to visit them. They predate the hothouses at Kew and were just as large. This palm tree was taken to the newly removed Crystal Palace, which had moved to Sydenham from Hyde Park, where the area now called Crystal Palace is. And that was the end of Lodgers. But there is still a Lodgers Road, which is just off Mare Street. And Lodgers Road cuts through the land where Lodgers Nursery would have been, comes out on Mare Street, just south of the town hall. And the town hall, as you can see, has a pair of rather wonderful canary palms out the front, which you may have noticed if ever you've gone up there or got the bus past Hackney Town Hall. And I wonder if those trees were planted as an homage to cottagers who were famed for their palm trees. So that's the Lodgers of Hackney. My next one is down in South London, and the astronaut trees on Kennington Road. So I don't know whether anybody's been down there, but if ever you get a double-decker bus on Kennington Road, the 159 is a good route. Look out on the plane trees which are planted on that street for these little tags which are on all the plane trees along there, and each one recalls an Apollo astronaut. And for some reason, they've been nailed to the trees of that part of the road. And it was for many, many years a great mystery. They appeared in the late 1990s. Some have gone missing. Some of the trees have since, have had been cut down, sadly. Some of them have collided with Amazon vans or Ocado vans or whatever they get down in that part. And so we've lost some of them, unfortunately. But a couple of years ago, it was discovered that they were put on there by the Interplanetary Society, which is based nearby, but it's still a bit of a mystery as to why they were put there. But it's a wonderful arboreal sort of anomaly, really, a wonderful thing to see, these little tags on incongruously on the plane trees there. Here's some more of them. So that's the plane trees of Kennington Road. So my final tree is another mulberry tree, and this one's down in Deptford, and this is a tree which resides in a little tiny park called Sayes Court Park. And what is Sayes Court Park now was just a tiny garden of what was the garden of John Evelyn. And John Evelyn, the 17th century diarist, and author of books including Silver, a book about trees, lived next door to the Royal Dockyard at Deptford. And he wrote that book as a way to encourage landowners to plant more trees, because the Royal Docks or the Navy was worried about their timber supply. But he was essentially an aristocrat, and he lived in this house which had a large garden where he planted lots of trees, and it's known that he had mulberry trees in there. And in 1698, he leased the house to Tsar Peter the Great. So this is true. Tsar Peter the Great came to Deptford to learn about shipbuilding. He was in his early 20s, and while he was here, he leased Evelyn's house, stayed next door to the shipyard, and learnt all about the construction of a navy from the Royal Navy. While he was there, he and his chums, his imperial pals from the Russian court, completely trashed Evelyn's house and garden, and this is recorded in Evelyn's diary, actually, because he was very upset about it when he had to come and clear up all the mess afterwards. But overnight, a few years ago, this stone plaque appeared, and the Russian embassy put it next to this very old mulberry tree, claiming that it was planted by Peter the Great in 1698 by way of thank you for staying at Evelyn's house. But I think it's probably fake news. Unfortunately, the tree's been aged by some experts who seem to think it's probably rather younger than 1698, but it's a great story. And I think I'd like to maybe consider this quote from John Evelyn from his Silver, which maybe he was thinking about the young Tsar when he wrote this. So that's about it. I'm hoping you're going to have loads of questions for me. But before that, I'm just going to run through my books. So if anybody wants to buy a book, I have written these various books about trees in London, London street trees. You can buy signed copies from me on my website, thestreettree.com. and then I've written this map, which was published. Both of these books have been published during lockdown, pretty much. So this is a map, which is the Great Trees of London, and it has 46 trees, which I've picked out across London, including some of the ones I've shown you. And it's a sort of a wide and broad selection of trees, which I think have interesting stories, are really ancient, are very interesting, or worth knowing more about. And my other book is called London is a Forest. And this is a book which takes as its aim 6 walks around London. So I walk from the edge right into the centre of London and talk about all the landscapes and interesting trees and the people have shaped it. Some of the content which I've been discussing today, but in a lot more detail. And some of those go through some of the landscapes I've talked about, including Richmond Park, Greenwich, and various other places. So those are my books. And this is me. I'm on the social media as The Street Tree, and my blog is thestreettree.com. So thank you all very much.